Hello, my name is Isaac Sharp, and this is my final presentation for the New Testament survey class. First, we're going to talk about, since we have this New Testament, does that mean that we can completely do away with the Old Testament, or in with the new, out with the old? And it's not that way at all. The New Testament does not mean that the Old Testament is useless. The New Testament simply brings to light themes in the Old Testament that are easier to grasp, easier to explain, and just new ways of looking at things that without the New Testament, without the Gospels, without the epistles, without all the other things that go into the New Testament would be in the dark about the Old Testament. I mean, if we simply take into account the pictures of Christ in the Old Testament, my favorite picture of Christ in the Old Testament is in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And we wouldn't be able to look at this story like we do without the example of Jesus, of the Christ. So in the story of Abraham and Isaac, we see Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac to God, and we see Abraham's great faith in that he did. And so when we get into like the more particulars of this story, and we start to look at it in the lens of God and Jesus, we see that Abraham, being the father, is a stand-in for God the Father, needing to sacrifice his only begotten son, Isaac, and Jesus. This son who was long awaited, Isaac. Abraham was a very old man, and Sarah was a very old woman by the time that Isaac came, so he was waiting for so long for the promised son to come. And then we look at the story of Jesus, how he was prophesied for so long in the Old Testament, and that all the nation of Israel was waiting on this promised coming Messiah, and it was fulfilled in Jesus. Then we go on further and we see that when Isaac and Abraham were going up the mountain, Abraham laid the wood for the sacrifice on Isaac's back as they traveled up the mountain. And when we see the story of Jesus that we're all familiar of, when he is going up to be crucified for our sins and to pay the price that we should have paid ourselves, what did they have laid upon him? They laid the cross, the wood for the sacrifice, on Jesus' back as they led him up the hill, Golgotha. And there's many other ways that the stories in the Old Testament, when we look at them through the lens of what Jesus has done, come to a new light, and we can see new ways of looking at things in the Old Testament. And that's only possible by being familiar and knowing our New Testament. A very important aspect, of course, if you're studying anything, and especially if you're going to put your faith and your belief in a particular set of books or a particular set of manuscripts, is how can you trust it? How can we trust that the New Testament is, in fact, not only reliable in the fact that what it says it's true, but who's to say even the contents of the New Testament are the same today as they were approximately 2,000 years ago when it was being written. And one of the ways that people try to discredit the New Testament writings is that they were spread out so far in so many different languages that there's so many different translations. How can we be sure that it is actually the right thing? And that's used as a mark against the New Testament. Some people like to point to the old children's game of telephone that we have here on the slide, and they ask, like, well, you know, when you play the game of telephone and you say peas into one friend's ear, and then it goes and goes and goes until finally at the end the last person says fleas, and the whole story is changed. And they liken that to the story of the New Testament being translated into this language, into Greek, into Aramaic, into other languages around at the time, and then translate from those into translations that we have today. How can we be sure that that's right? And that way of looking at it makes sense if you don't think about it for too long. So we have a better way to look at it is if in this game of telephone, after every second or third person, they would go back and say, hey, was the word that you said peas or fleas? And they could go back and double check every so often. And it would be so much easier to get to the end with the correct word, because you can go back and check the older manuscripts that are around while you have them. You can go back and you can double check that your translations are right. And even now we can go back and double check even the oldest manuscripts that we have that are dated very early after the first ones were written, after the autographs were written. And we can see that the New Testament that we have today is almost word for word identical to the New Testament that we would have had back when the texts were written. So this was just a brief overview of a certain topic of the New Testament survey. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.